Hey there, it's Chris from Good Roads, and in my last video I did a bunch of the prep for one of my most advanced builds yet. I built the mold and made cores for a Moonshine manufacturing style dual core composite deck. Well, now I've got my sidewalls poured, I've got my cores prepped, I've got my mold built. Let's press this thing. To start with, there are a couple additional materials I need to cut to size from my layup, and in case you're interested, I got all this stuff from snowboardmaterials.com. Not affiliated or anything, that's just where I bought it. The first is some plastic snowboard top sheet material. This would normally go on the top of a snowboard or a set of skis to protect the epoxy from UV and help keep everything safe from the elements. I'm going to be putting this on both the top and the bottom of my deck for what I hope will be a super clean, high-end look. So I cut myself 2 sheets. Next I need to cut my glass. This is a 22 ounce triaxial cloth, and I'm also cutting 2 sheets of that to sandwich my bamboo cores. Nice, okay. Speaking of cores, I decided to try to trim mine down a bit. This would reduce the surface area of the components being epoxied together and will hopefully reduce the amount of epoxy that I need to use for my layup because, dang, that stuff is expensive. Next I took a stab at a problem that I've been puzzling over. These 2 cores need to stay aligned so that the sidewalls are consistent and don't shift around during pressing. And for this time around, I'm going to experiment with using zip ties to keep them in place. So I drilled 2 holes in both cores at the nose and the tail, and the ties can be threaded through those holes to lock everything together. Then I marked my cores for orientation. And that's all the parts of my board ready to go. Over on the mold side of things, I'm continuing to experiment with the qualities of a 3D printed mold and the amount of surface area I can get from leaving my infill grid exposed to save plastic. For a purely wooden layup like a skateboard deck, this works out just fine. I've got a couple things I still want to test about weight, but the grid does seem good enough. For a composite though, I suspect it wouldn't give even enough pressure to squeeze out all the excess resin, so I'm going to try lining my mold with some foam rubber. This is just a cheap mat you can get from Home Depot, and I'm cutting 2 sheets of it for the top and bottom of the mold. I use some masking tape to tack the foam in place since I'm not really sure if I want this to be a permanent part of this setup or not. One last thing I want to do is cut some sheets of plastic to put above and below my layup in the mold. Epoxy doesn't stick to plastic unless it's treated, so this will stop my board from gluing itself to the mold. With all that done, everything is prepped. It's time to mix some resin. I'm using the same epoxy that I used for my snowboard build, which is the in-house stuff from snowboardmaterials.com, and I'm pre-measuring a couple of batches for myself since I'm not quite sure how much resin I'm going to need for this layup. I mixed my first batch and transferred it over to a larger container to help prevent thermal runaway, and then I started my layup. I wetted out my layer of protective top sheet, added my first sheet of glass and soaked it with resin, wetted out the bottom of core number 1, then the top, mixed my second batch of epoxy, which worked out perfectly because I'm at the halfway point, and did the same for core number 2. At this point I grabbed my zip ties and threaded them through the holes I drilled earlier to keep the cores aligned. Then I added my second sheet of glass. And finally, the top sheet material that's actually going on the top. Then it's just adding the sheet of protective plastic and it's over to the press, right? Hey, not bad on the time there. Not bad. Well, not quite. Even though I built myself a bigger press for this project, I forgot to account for the added height of the foam rubber. It looks like I'm gonna need some taller bolts. But in the meantime, I can use bar clamps to get the molds compressed enough to where I can get the spars in place. Then I can use an impact driver to cinch everything down tight. And that's the layup done. All that's left is to let the epoxy cure, and I actually gave this one a week to set up. The 2-core construction is actually pretty stiff, and I wanted to give myself the best chance at avoiding deflects coming out of the molds. After the cure was done, I cracked the mold open. Alright, let's get you out of there. Well, I certainly didn't squeeze all the epoxy out. It's a little lumpy. That bottom looks fantastic though. I don't know, I think it might have worked. Feels solid. That heavy. Oh dude, I can see the... Yeah, let me see if I can show you this. This is cool. I can see the sidewalls through the top sheet. Yeah, you can see that. You see them showing through there? I can probably use that to mark out the deck shape. Okay, so far from perfect, but also not too shabby. Being able to see the sidewalls through the blank is such a great happy accident. I set up some bright lights under the board and traced the shape of the deck right from the internals of the deck itself. This way I don't have to worry at all about things being misaligned or busting through the sidewalls. Once the board was marked, I used a jigsaw with a composite blade to cut it out, refined the shape with a belt sander, and used my 3D printed edge rounding jig to finish the rails. The glass and the epoxy in this deck dulled the heck out of my bit, by the way. I have to get myself some carbide blades going forward. On a related note, the enthusiasm for these dome jigs that I've gotten from the community has been amazing. I was really hoping to have the prints available for sale by now, but both of my 3D printers went down at the same time, so I've been in repair and calibration hell for the past 2 weeks. If nothing goes horribly wrong, fingers crossed, I should have these available for sale as print on demand starting next week. In the meantime, if you have a printer, the files are already available over on goodroadscollective.com. Say a prayer to the 3D printing gods for me, and hopefully I can get them into your hands soon. Since the deck has full sidewalls and I wrapped it in that top sheet material, I don't actually need to apply a finish. It's just a matter of a little cleanup on the rails, marking and drilling my bolt holes using my Scarab drilling guide, and since mine is a mountainboard deck, I also need to drill for bindings, which I did using this little jury rig jig that I put together. A little bit of acetone to clean everything up, and that's it. The deck is done. And for my first time trying out this kind of build, I think it came out pretty good. The proof is in the pudding, so let's get it assembled and see what we've got. Well, it certainly looks nice, but... that is one flexy deck. Honestly, hitting any kind of jumps or advanced terrain on this thing would probably make the deck bottom out, which is a real bummer. But with my feet in the bindings, I've still got enough clearance for some free ride, so let's take it over the trails and check it out. okay. It's okay. The flex really is too much, but it's a fun deck to ride, except it's fun in more of a, this is kind of sketchy way than it's fun in a, this is a really good deck way. But that's okay. This was a really experimental build for me. First time pressing a composite deck with a printed mold, first time doing the dual core technique, first time with this new set of molds with an experimental geometry. It was a fun build, and I think the new techniques show a lot of potential. But I think as far as a prototype goes, I bit off a little bit more than I can chew. I mean, that was a really time-consuming, expensive project to go through just to find out at the end that the deck has too much flex. A fun thing to do for a YouTube video, but maybe not the best way to go about product development. So for my mountain board explorations, I think the next step is actually going to be to switch back over to veneers, which is a much cheaper, faster construction method, so that I can really focus on the shape and geometry of the deck. And once that's nailed down, I think that would be the time to circle back to composites and use those techniques, those more advanced techniques, to improve what I hope will already be a really, really good board. That said, your mileage may vary. A different core construction could add stiffness. I imagine glass choice would make a huge impact on a build like this. And concave running the full length of the deck, that could also address the stiffness problem as well. But if you're making a deck that's not a mountain board, if you're making a skateboard or a longboard, it might be stiff enough as is. I do find that mountain boards tend to need more stiffness than our board sport brethren. So, we're learning out here. If you found the project interesting and maybe you learned something and you want to see more awesome DIY board sport projects, just go right ahead and subscribe. If you got questions or comments or any advice on composite builds, I'd love to hear it. Leave it down below. Gotta give a huge shout out, as always, to my supporters over on Patreon. It's your help that allows me to explore these more advanced and more expensive construction techniques. If you'd like to help contribute to that exploration, go to patreon.com/goodroads or check out the support links in the description down below. And that's gonna be it for this one. As always, I love having you guys along for the ride. So until next time, I'll see you soon. I set up some bright lights under the board and trace the shep. I set up some bright lights under the board and trace the shep. What even is a shep? I traced the shep. I set up some, dang it.